Before we get into the podcast today, I want to talk about a really cool service that I tried with one of my players called Champs IQ. Kind of confusing because it's spelled different. So it's Champs and then EYE and the letter Q. So Champs IQ compared to Hockey IQ here, the podcast. Really, really cool. You submit 10 minutes of edited game footage. Their expert analysts evaluate the player across more than 15 key performance attributes. You get an overall rating, a projection against NCAA Division I potential, and just real clear actual priorities. So you know exactly what to focus on next and where to put your time. Especially in the summer, there's so much time to figure out what should I be doing. I think Champs IQ is a great way to think about where do I need to put my time? What's the next thing that needs to be knocked down that I can take off in my game? Champs IQ bridges that gap, takes that guesswork out. You get the detailed, specific, accurate assessment. Really, really cool. Recommend it. If you go to their website, www.champsiq, and remember that's EYEQ.com, use the coupon code HockeyIQ, spelled just IQ, Hockey IQ. Use that. 10% comes off your bill on your submission. I recommend it. Did it with my player, had a great experience. Check it out.
On the Hockey IQ podcast today, we bring on Louis Boulet of lb-hockey.com, one of the finest websites out there that everyone should subscribe to if you love player cards and all things. Any kind of, I would say this is just great for any kind of nerd that loves talking about development, etc. You've got the development matrix up there, etc. So, one, glad to have you. Two, what brought you to get into all the numbers behind this?
Thanks so much for having me on, Greg. I mean, it's been a long, I think it's been on the cards for a long time for me. I've always been a big hockey fan and numbers guy. Took a while before they finally started coming together, but like as a kid, I was always a huge Sens guy, growing up in Ottawa, and it was right around that time where the Sens were like really fantastic, winning President's trophies with the pizza line with Heatley, Alfredson, and Spezza. So it was easy to get into hockey early on at that era. And I don't know, like the numbers always came quickly to me. It started first with a fascination with like remembering like dinosaur top speeds and like all of that back in the day, and eventually just melted into, realizing I should just do this full time. I pivoted from thinking of going to chemistry in my university, going into grade 12 and into university, and then thinking, you know what, I do this so much in my free time already. Let's just go into stats and data science to try to get this hockey thing going. And it's gotten me to where I am today. I'm big hockey guy, big math guy, and it's kind of an area that I've wanted to expand on with how the public sphere is, right? There's so much in terms of RAPM or on ice play driving and general impact, but I felt like there was kind of a niche for more stylistic player evaluation that could be explored. And there's some data out there that definitely allows you to do that. So it's definitely been a long endeavor to try to engineer the data to get to the point where you can get those kinds of insights. But once you do that, it really opens you to a whole new world of possibilities that I've been happy to get into with LB Hockey.
Yeah, and for hockey nerds like me, it's been cool to see your work kind of come together. Like I think the one that most sticks out that we should start on today would be like, how the heck do you rate goalies? They're a bit of voodoo.
Yeah.
But you're even throwing in there like recovery, vision, play anticipation, all separate categories.
hmm
Which, most people are like, oh, he reads the play well, he's always in the right spot. Okay, end all be all. You're going in a little bit further. So dive into maybe some of the questions you're posing to yourself that brought this about.
Yeah, the way I like to look at it mostly is everything I want to do is skill focused, especially if you're talking about at the player level, right? Uh, is specifically when I'm watching the game, what are particular spots in a player's toolkit, whether that's a skater or a goalie, or even like team, if you branch it out stylistically, that I want to be able to measure when I watch the game. And then moving from there, you kind of see, okay, is there direct paths to do this with the data, or can I get a pretty close proxy? And then just general knowledge with hockey and working with the data kind of gets you to a point where you find the best formula for that. Goalies in particular came a decent bit later than the skaters, obviously. Uh, you're 100% right in the sense that it feels like goalies have lagged behind because it seems like the role is so much more, maybe not one note, but easier to quantify in one number, right? Where you could just look at goals saved above expected or something like that. And I do think there's more to it, and that's what led me to building specifically the steals and chokes log, right? Where you look at kind of their game breaking ability as well, where a steal would be quantified when a player outperforms their goal saved above expected in a game, and it kind of creates a difference between the team's win differential and that. So I think it's really interesting, and there's so much more nuance to that, and that's kind of what brought me to wanting to measure all these specific things. But yeah, like there is data out there, even though if it's limited, especially when you compare it to the MLB or things like that, right? Where plays are not only way more easily isolated, but also there's way less variables with all the players involved and at what points. So I think there's still a lot that we can do in there, as you said, specifically recovery, looking at how goalies handle rebounds and separating them to specific skills. First, how they absorb it, if they freeze puck specifically, then if they can redirect. So how many rebounds actually happen after that in recovery, if they can save the following ones that do leak through. So that's one thing I think has been really interesting is separating parts of plays to really see how skills stand out individually between them, and then maybe how they can shoulder between all of those in the process.
Yeah, and I love the idea around like recovery and rebounds going together because how you do a rebound will definitely help your recovery. Are you having to scramble?
Hmm.
Or I always think about Marty Brodeur, like his rebounds seem to always end up in the upper netting or at least way up there in the glass, where like the puck's so high, just by the time it goes up there and comes back down, he's had time to get back into some sort of decent positioning rather than have to scramble around, maybe like a Jonathan Quick where you just see him on their chest the entire time and swimming around out there. But I, I'm curious of like how do you separate out vision and play anticipation? Because people are like, oh, you can see the game normally, or he's a great game reader. But those are two very specific details and nuances. If you're looking at a goalie or you're a skill evaluator and you're looking at goalies, what are you looking for?
So, to me, the way I look at it is the closer the shot comes to the net, the more it needs to be obviously positioning in advance and instinct, and then the further you move out, the more that you can let your eyes do the work, right? Because then you have more time to actually see, track, and just generally anticipate things. And these specific metrics are mostly, and a lot of the data behind LV hockey is thanks to the amazing work that Corey Schneider from All Three Zones does. But in his track data, he has screens on shots and uh, a bunch of passing related metrics. So the vision one in particular is a blend of shots from further out and ones that get screened that allow you to kind of measure that. And then play anticipation is looking at shots that come quickly after a sequence of shots that come quickly after a sequence of passes, because then you could see a goalie is being able to follow the play as it goes along, anticipate where it's going to go next.
All right. And then, since we're in the off season here, which goalie or two might you be looking at as, hey, this goalie's actually better than they're probably currently perceived? I'd be happy if my team got this guy. Like for me, I feel like Connor Ingram might be a guy that smart team would go after. Question be then to follow up with you is a why? Like what are you looking at?
Yeah, Ingram's interesting specifically to me because, I haven't grown up in Ottawa and being a Sens fan my whole life. There are reports that supposedly he will be coming to Ottawa on July 1st, and Ottawa desperately needing a backup right after everything that happened last year with Marilyn and having to sign Reimer midseason. But Ingram's a guy that I'm definitely looking at. I think he was quite consistent for what he did last year, especially as a backup goalie. Whether that's in terms of keeping a decent level of performance game to game, adjusting to the game pretty early on, like some of the metrics in the cards, specifically in the consistency area, are looking at warm-up speed, so how good a player does early on in games and in periods, endurance, so flipping that and looking at later on. And Ingram's the kind of guy who, again, if I'm looking at a backup, I don't really care about game breaking ability as much if I feel confident in my team, right? And I think the Senators are pretty strong defensively, and a lot of metrics would corroborate that. So looking at somebody who can bring at least a decent amount of consistency game to game is what I would look at. And in fact, looking at Ingram's card right now that I have up, one of the things I do try to measure is attempting to assign ideal team systems to goalies based on all of these metrics. So if you're looking at Ingram, for example, you see that his strengths are a little bit of consistency, maybe not being quite as strong on low danger stuff here and there, and various things like that. Then you assign it to a specific system where Ottawa thrives specifically in Ingram's weaknesses, but maybe lets in a little bit more shots that fall into Ingram's strengths, and that really kind of makes that puzzle piece work. And so Ottawa ranks third in Ingram's ideal systems, which I think could really serve him well if he came here as a backup.
All right. So you mentioned a little bit about, warm up speed, endurance, and I'm curious about consistency. Like, how are you measuring consistency? Because I would say it's extremely important, particularly as you go up the ranks. It's kind of just like that dependability that uh, you know, Patrice Bergeron, always in the right spot, be an example of
Mhm.
good consistency where you're always available. You're like 7-Eleven gas station. You're never closing. Like Waffle House during the hurricane season in the South. Like you're just always going to be open. Just like easy to
Yeah.
play with that allows you to consistently have the same results. That repeatability, like are you going to the spots that you can repeat again and again, or maybe more like a riverboat gambler?
Yeah, and consistency is something that I've spent a lot of time trying to nail down. And the way I measure it is different for both goalies and skaters. I talked about this last December, I guess it would be. Yeah, December when I put out my article kind of diving into the whole uh, method behind the standings points model that I have to try to capture player contributions. And consistency does end up being the most impactful skill, right? If you look at ones that have the biggest impact on a team's success, on average, their players are most consistent if a team is successful. And that makes sense because it essentially acts as a sort of modifier, right, for how often you can apply all of your skills and at a high level, that being. So the problem is that is also, funnily enough, consistency is one of the least consistent skills because year over year, players have a tough time upholding that. So, how do you get into measuring that's so seemingly volatile and can be so impactful? For skaters, I've tried I have a whole article on it that looks to kind of use a blend of integral calculus to measure that. And that's looking at how often a player scores in higher percentiles than expected given their role for individual games and uh, accounting for them improving over the year to not penalize earlier performances in the season as long as they keep improving. For goalies, it's a little bit different and I'd say probably simpler. Uh, there's one metric in our cards that's called game quality spread, which looks at kind of assigning a quality level to each individual game. And in that case, you can essentially just penalize goalies for worse games and bucket all of the good to incredible games a little bit more similarly. So then if goalies have a high percentage of games that are below a certain threshold, then you could say that they're consistent or inconsistent.
All right. So you mentioned using the calculus, we're doing consistency, but it's hard to have the consistency from year to year per se. Obviously the top players are going to be top players, but those
Hmm.
bottom ones are going to come and go. And you mentioned about how it relates dramatically to team success. I'm curious, what are other areas that lead to team success? I'm thinking it's like support off the puck is probably massive, especially in
Hmm.
NHL where the skill differential is not as much as maybe, if you're looking at youth hockey, for example, we've got these massive skill gaps where maybe you don't have to have that because you can beat guys one on one more easily.
Yeah.
Playmaking is probably be more important. So I'm curious, what are those areas that relate to team success?
So I think it differs a good bit if you separate by position in terms of forwards and defensemen. The off-puck support obviously ends up being way more impactful offensively for forwards than defensemen. I'm pretty sure for defensemen, it ended up being one of the least impactful skills because as a defenseman, them getting involved off puck usually isn't as important as it would for a forward who's trying to get open for a tip in front of the net or a one timer, whereas a defenseman is more roaming at the top of the zone. So that's something that you would expect. I think there's specific player archetypes that kind of jump out to me for impactful skills. No matter if you're a forward or defenseman, passing related metric end up being really, really important. The ones that I measure are like importance to teammate offense, which is a blend of how much a player improves flow within their team's passing system and how much they influence that or improve the efficiency with specific connections to their players. Playmaking, so setting up chances and generally utilizing their teammates with passes throughout the ice is a big thing. Forwards, you start seeing a little bit more offensive transition metrics, for example, somebody who's a good puck mover, not just with passing, but with carrying the puck across the zone, both in terms of entry efficiency and volume. Those end up being two of the most important skills. And then defensively, as expected, you would see a lot more D zone oriented metrics come up for defensemen. So chance suppression, being able to mitigate pressure in their own zone, even defensive transition metrics such as entry chance defense. So looking at how often a player allows chances against them when they're targeted on the rush. So essentially what you would expect, but having done the actual work to get the data on that was pretty satisfying.
So it sounds a lot of transition like play. Is there anything specific in zone? Like every coach for the longest time's talked about net front presence, for example. Not the things that you put under the
Yes.
tree, but stand in front of the goalie.
So I've got two separate skills in terms of that's one thing I was going to get at is net front play, and another skill that I've spent a lot of time trying to refine my formula for it, and uh, it ends up being a little bit more impactful offensively, is what I found. Offensive net front play is the sixth highest ranking impactful skill out of the 25 that we measure for forwards. Defensemen, I think it's more in the mid range, I think around 11 or 12, which goes to show that maybe the way I measure it is a little bit more difficult, as you would expect for defensemen, because we don't have like specific tie-up numbers, and you have to use some defensive proxies to estimate how good a defenseman is in that sense. But for defensemen, for example, puck management is a big thing in the defensive zone. So looking at maybe not the value of the breakouts that they get out or specific retrievals in the defensive zone, but at least not being able to turn it over because, as you would expect, a turnover in the defensive zone, the breakout, is way more likely to turn into a chance against than something further out in the zone, right? So those are two things that I think are really interesting with how both different positions are kind of impacted differently with their in zone important skills.
So then you got me thinking here. There's clearly play styles. I'm talking about like net front presence
Mhm.
for defensemen. Like there's the big bruiser you think about, the 6'7", 240-pound D guy. And then you've got the Samuel Girards, Lane Hudsons of the world, where they're not going to be tying up with guys in front. Like that's just a waste of their talents. They're not leaning into what they do best. So I'm curious from like play styles because everyone needs to be physically able to play. Like you can't play the game just in your head. You actually have to physically go and execute. I'm curious of like what level of physical play are we looking at? And maybe where on the ice are we doing it? For Lane Hudson, it's probably fronting pucks, or you're making sure sticks are tied up and letting the goalie handle the screen where you're not trying to double screen versus physical play of another guy is going to be more around pushing people. So I'm curious, maybe starting there, and then we can dive in a little bit deeper into physical play, talking about forwards, etc.
Yeah, and that's an area that I've done a good bit of work in, especially recently. Earlier this month, I gave a talk at the Linkoping Hockey Analytics Conference that was essentially diving into what it means to be physical in the modern NHL. How do you go about defining that and measure players specifically in those areas? And kind of bridging that gap between going for players that are physical, but maybe not in the meaningful sense, kind of just physical to be physical, like you're throwing a hit, but you're getting yourself out of the play, right? Or you're tying up a guy, but you're getting penalties without really advancing the state of your play. But then you have some players offensively that might be less known to be physical, but actually progress through contact way more often than you expect. So kind of getting to that bridge is something I was looking at. Um, Looking specifically at players that you've mentioned here, Lane Hudson, I think, is a guy that could. Uh, he's shown signs to at least have the ability to progress through that offensively with the puck. Defensively, it's not quite there yet. As we said, the net front presence defensive score. It's not a perfect evaluation of the metric, but he ranks pretty lowly there as we would expect, right? And I'm really interested to see how he would do in some other high contact areas that I'm measuring. For example, looking at transition contests. So that's being able to deny entries and create zone exits under pressure. Given Hudson's skills in his game, you would expect him to be able to really evade players, but he ranks fairly lowly there. And I wonder if, the pressure when an opposing forechecker comes in at him, like you look at the Carolina series, that's exactly how the OT, the game three OT winner happened, right? He was seemingly going to be fine on his own exit and ends up turning it over, and that resulted into the goal against but by I want to say Svetch ended up scoring that goal. I can't remember exactly. I think Aho had the screen, but that's the point is looking at trying to capture measures outside of just regular hits and blocks or things like that, where a player's using their body and really honing in on meaningful physical skills.
I feel like the most impactful when you're thinking about like maybe ozone play would just be like down low playmaking. Like you just can't avoid contact there.
Hmm.
So if you're able to do some playmaking down there, you've got some good pieces of physical play, even though it may not be throwing the big hit. It could be just rolling off contact and being able to keep the puck moving and that kind of stuff. So I'm curious when you're thinking about thinking through the physical play, maybe just in those high, like you're going to get bodied up in some shape or form rather than the big open ice hits or um, you think about guys like Tom Wilson just running and trying to line guys up and crank them through the neutral zone.
And I think you see that in a lot of bigger forwards that are still really strong offensively, right? Like names that jump out to me, obviously the Kachuk brothers are pretty strong on that side. Like I've never seen a player use his behind quite like Brady Kachuk to protect pucks along the boards, deeper than the goal line, and then turning around to make a pass. His brother Matthew's like arguably one of the best wingers in the game at doing that. Mark Scheifele is somebody that makes me kind of think of the ideal person on that side. Obviously, he's looked more as a dynamic offensive piece, but still a pretty big dude, and he really is quite the student of the game and knows so much about it that it's no surprise to see him kind of blend those two elements, even though he's not known to be a shutdown guy. It's just, again, how do you use your body to leverage your skills? And that's exactly what he's been doing low in the offensive zone through various types of passes to improve his team's chances and wade through what essentially is, as you said, a more proactively filled with contact area, right? And willingly going to those spots and often succeeding. It's really interesting to see players like that. In terms of UFAs that are available, one guy that I'm looking at, even though he's a little bit on the older side, Anders Lee has been able to do that for years now, right? And he could probably come in for cheap for like a year or two and could add that sort of dimension to a team. And I'm interested to see, as I said, for the Sens, a team that just lost Kachuk, maybe that's the kind of player that you add in after losing him and thinking, okay, it won't be to the same level and it could only be for a year or two. But if you're looking to fill that stylistic role, right, could be the type of option that you go after.
Uh, and the NHL is also a weird spot because it's the league that most values body positioning at all times. So when you're talking about the Chuck brothers, like they may not be the most fleet of foot, definitely not the fastest, but they make you operate around them. They're gaining the body positioning, so you have to react to that. And it's kind of that proactive contact of sorts, where you're using
Hmm.
your butt as an asset. Um, fill that one in. But the proactive contact where it's you're still having the initiative. It's good old military. Like once you have the initiative, never drop it. Uh, but
Hmm.
applying it to hockey and it's something I see at the younger ages where it's a lot of fishing. I think of Patrick Laine as the classic example. Like, I don't want to get my jersey dirty, so I'm just going to try to use my stick to fish this puck out of a pile rather than like, let me establish some body positioning. Maybe I need
Yeah,
to
and
put
you'll
the puck in my
lose
feet and shuffle.
your entire leverage by doing that, right? You're not going to get anything out of just like leaning a little bit one way rather than really going and planting yourself and establishing the kind of positioning and physical leverage that you can, right? And that's one thing I think is really interesting and an area that obviously there's multiple parts of hockey that I think could benefit from enhanced tracking and statistics. And that's something that I like to see way more integrated into the common sphere if we get that data to a point.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And I also think like those players that may not do the proactive contact tend to be the ones that also have like the really bad injuries, your knees, your shoulders, etc., because they're constantly putting themselves in bad spots
I think
physically
Logan
rather.
Brown's a good example of that. Like I know he didn't end up really being a full-time NHLer, but you're talking about a guy with a huge frame, right, who was looked at as a more offensive piece that could tend to use his body a little bit more. And once he gets to the pro ranks, it's just injury after injury after injury. And some of that could be just due to awkwardness with his size, maybe, but I think that's a big thing, right? You learn to not absorb contact or generally try to shy away from it, and that's not going to prepare you for when it comes.
And it's such a big piece, especially on the North American rinks that are much smaller. The ones that are overseas and the Olympic size, you can probably get away with that a lot more.
Hmm.
But North America, where contact is guaranteed, you're having to have it. It's not a nice to have; it's a must have skill set that needs to be developed in some shape or form. Which is the constant like size argument, but really it's more around how do you do body positioning. Like Stankoven, like constantly is getting good body positioning, and it may not
Hmm.
be through guys, it could be under guys, for example. So super, super cool how you're defining physical play beyond just the hits and what
Hmm.
leads into it, down low playmaking, transition, proactive contacts, etc. I think there's so much nuance there that a lot of experienced guys understand, especially development staff and coaching staffs, but really is you bring it to the forefront, which is absolutely massive because there's so many great details that go into that.
Hmm.
Next thing I want to talk about here um, is around just play styles and contributions in the modern NHL. So I'll let you, I'll just toss that up and let you run with it for a little bit.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it with the link that between contact and specifically development staff and coaching staff at the NHL level is that's an area that I really wanted to move in. Obviously, I mentioned wanting to add a little bit more nuance to how we evaluate players, but the goal I think is to really build a better bridge between what you see on the ice and what coaches may value, what GMs think of their team and all of that, and what you have in the data, right? And really expanding that to be able to build a solid foundation that you could move forward with in terms of what you can apply to player development or team tendencies and how you build your lineup, right? And that's one thing that was really important to me when building the entirety of LB hockey. That was pretty much the first brainstorm I had back in the day and what I essentially built upon. And that opens you up to so many more possibilities, right? Once you get all of those skills that we mentioned earlier on, whether that's playmaking or scoring related stuff like individual creation or finishing ability, offensive and defensive transition metrics, in zone defensive and offensive things, checking ability, it opens you up to a bunch more like player style analysis, right? We talked about Anders Lee and how he could be a good fit for Brady Tkachuk. You look at the numbers that they have and that's exactly the kind of player that you could look to fill into that spot, even though the talent level isn't the same, the style is there. And in my model, one of the things I have in many of my cards are essentially flashes of, right? What kind of similar playing style does a player hold relative to another? And Anders Lee's number one comparable is Brady Tkachuk, and it might be vice versa as well. Tkachuk's might be Lee's too. But that's one thing I think that's really interesting when you're looking at a team and thinking, okay, if this player's gone, how can I look to replace them? And then who can I look to match them with? That's another thing that I've really liked diving into is building a sort of proxy for chemistry with players and how they can play with each other. Obviously, there's always going to be an unknown element with how they think the game. That's not something that can be measured, I think, for now. We might get there eventually. But looking at how their skill sets would blend together and potentially bring you extra value on your team as a line together with that chemistry is something that's really interesting. And I'll probably have an article out for it at some point, maybe by the end of the year. But I have a few dashboards that are specifically tailored to that, right? One of them is the line compatibility lab, where you can put in either two defensemen or three forwards together and see how their toolkits interlock and mesh together and the extra value you'd get out of that particular chemistry.
So when you're thinking about play style, like is there consistencies? Like here's the areas of the game that you have to have for forwards, have to have for defense, have to have for goalies. Um, Is it areas we're going into on the ice? If you're a winger, you're probably going to these areas and you need to kind of these kind of play styles. I'm curious because we're obviously going to take that play style and then we're going to try to find that mesh, the one that completes you. But I'm curious of just like the non-negotiables. Like a defenseman has to be able to go back under pressure and start the breakout. Like that's a non-negotiable for a defenseman. So you better have pretty good scanning habits and communication habits to work with a teammate. Or you better have the shakeability in your skating. Like what are kind of some of these play styles that we're looking at? Because there's obviously Mark Stone is very different from Nikolai Ehlers.
Right. Yeah. And I think there definitely are certain things that stand out when you look at the top players in the league. As you said, for defensemen, there's no be all end all, but looking at combinations of skill metrics is where it gets really interesting. I think no matter what, you can look at any defenseman up in the league. All of them are going to be pretty involved in transition, whether that's on the breakout or offensively or defensively to stop the other team's rush. Obviously, you're looking at a bunch of different skills in that case. You're looking at puck moving, you're looking at passing, and especially skating ability, right? Uh, it's even breaking it down a little bit more. I think no matter what, as a defenseman, you either need to be consistent in terms of being able to turn or go out and retrieve pucks in the defensive zone, turn them into breakouts, or at least when you do get those pucks, not turn them over that often. So either it needs to be a high volume of getting possession of the puck and getting it out, or when you do get it, at least not turning it over at that point. And that plays into your partner a little bit, right? Because one of them can be the sort of default guy who goes and gets it and breaks it out, whereas the other, you at least need to be able to work with that partner, right? And consistently leverage their skills or move it out to continue play when they're not available. So that's the one thing that I think is really important for defensemen. On the forward side, ideally, those in the top of the lineup, obviously it changes throughout, right, in terms of roles for what a team looks like, higher up or lower down in the roster. But the optimal choice for a forward, I think most are kind of shaped like an offensive catalyst. They'll be able to create chances for themselves or for their teammates and are usually, again, pretty involved in terms of zone entries, whether that's frequency, efficiency, or at least being able to create chances off of those entries. That's one of the skills that Corey from All Three Zones has done a lot of work on, and that's something that pops up immediately from rookies, especially those that are drafted higher and have more offensive pedigree. That's a skill that jumps out right away and doesn't really, maybe not doesn't improve as much throughout the years, but it's just so evident early on that a player, you're going to see them carrying the puck into the zone and how skilled they are at that point. That's something that carries over very well because usually you have that open space. It's more getting to that point and after it where the space closes and kind of the pressure builds up and then it takes some time to adjust. But those are essentially what I'm looking at for top end forwards and defensemen and usually what comes up in the data. As for how it changes throughout the lineup, I did work with a couple of metrics before that to have in the we have a category in our player cards called team play. And one of them was looking to estimate player compatibility throughout an average roster. And that essentially looked at exactly how do you value certain skills based on the environment of the NHL. So if you're a first liner, what is the ideal type of role that you can play to support other average first liners and what their toolkits look like, right? So most of them are going to be very high level puck carriers, playmakers, and all of that, so, and might not be as good defensively. So a guy like Jason Robertson, who is such a great high level finisher, good defensively, but can still keep up offensively and keep play moving, has a really high compatibility scores because he meshes so well with what you'd expect from a first liner. And then as you move down in the lineup, those roles kind of change. Playmaking starts maybe being a little bit more scarce in the bottom six, but can be important for players that are one trick ponies as a goal scorer or defensive player. And so adding that sort of dimension really helps them a lot. So I think that's really interesting and something that could be worked on a little bit more to identify how skills change and how important they are, not just at the top of the lineup, but all the way throughout.
So first line support players, we need to be good at carrying pucks and doing some playmaking versus maybe those are still important, but less so as we go down the lineup. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's more what you'd be like more what you tend to see from your players. Like you think of the high level first liners that exist out there. You're thinking of the Connor McDavid's, Obviously, I'm going to throw in Tim Chisholm being a Sens fan, but those kind of dynamic pieces that can make or break the game with their puck carrying ability. So how do you complement that, right? I think you're looking at a shooter that can help defensively, but also keep up with their speed. And those kinds of players are not, maybe not as common, but at least fit into a specific mold that can really bring the most out of those types of players. Then as you move down, yeah, as you said, that playmaking gets a little bit less frequent. So adding that to a bottom six, I think, is really interesting. Even though sometimes you might see GMs prioritize having more of a shutdown line that doesn't have that sort of puck moving, but it is important to keep that to a degree lower down to maintain possession and ensure you don't bleed pucks. Because if you're not spending any time in the defensive zone at all, that's even better than having to rely on your defensive skills while you are in the D zone, right? Like that's the best way to prevent goals in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to go where you're going with that next, but before we get there, I'd love to continue down that line of line compatibility, kind of like the expected chemistry.
Hmm.
The very basic from the old world would be, okay, we need someone to get the puck, so we need someone who can forecheck decently. Then we need someone that they can get the puck to, the playmaker who can think and see the lanes, and then a finisher. So like the classic forechecker, playmaker, finisher, like that's how you got your offensive line. Defense, maybe you've got a bruiser and a puck mover together, for example. Curious how you're thinking about it through a modern day lens of what actually meshes.
Hmm. So I did some tried a bunch of different methods for this, and the way I've landed on it is essentially two-way chemistry, looking at both how a player affects his line mates and how he gets affected by his line mates, right? Because that in reality, that's how players interact with each other, and got it condensed to a few skills, specifically offensive transition, defensive transition, breakout ability, play driving offensively and defensively, and then more isolated skills such as checking, shooting, and passing. And there you're looking to, as a line, ideally, it'd be great if you can fill out all of those specific aspects of the game, but there are some that specifically work together, right? If you're looking at a passer, you want them to be paired with a good shooter, as you said. So you want to get somebody that has what I found anyway, the weights in terms of what should be prioritized in getting those lines together. You're looking at somebody who can start your possession, extend your possession, and then convert on those possessions, right? Usually that correlates to forechecking ability or transition ability that starts all the way back in the defensive zone. So potentially somebody that can shut down opposing possessions or start them through force offensively off dump ins on the forecheck, and then a puck carrier that can move it with this passing or is skating to get to a good chance, whether that's by creating a really good pass to a high danger spot or being able to set up somebody who's got a really high sense. And that's when you move to your scorer, right? Somebody that either is really smart around the net and able to get open on that sense or just convert with an absolutely blistering shot, as you said. So I think it's really interesting that, again, this is kind of an area of the game that matches what you would expect, but the data actually backing it up is something that I think is interesting because, again, there's not much work out there on what expected chemistry with players and their toolkits, right? So diving into that was always a priority of mine.
Yeah, it feels like you're just if you can, you're converting and trying to acquire players into your play style. And then you've got
Hmm.
like for me, public high school coach, you kind of get what you get. So how do you mesh what you have together?
Yeah,
There's not
maximize what
much
you
going.
have.
Yeah, there's no recruiting here. You can't do that. So what do you do with what you have? How do you best make them look good and look good
Mm.
to each other? I always talk with our kids about like you need to consistently make each other look good. And how do you do that? Well, you illuminate other players' strengths and you hide their weaknesses as best you can. So, you got a burner, probably place a puck in a spot where they can go get it. You got a guy who's a little bit slower, probably make the pass on his tape. Like that's going to be a better spot. So there's many ways to do it. I'm curious with the buckets. I like it. So it's kind of similar idea of like you get the forechecker, the playmaker, the finisher, but there's a little more nuance here. It's like how do you get the puck? And that could be in the D zone. Like Mitch Marner is fantastic in the D zone at getting pucks and
Yeah.
whether it be hiding a stick, like he thinks the game three steps ahead. So, he's positioning himself well ahead of it so he can get the puck, even though he may not be the number one forechecker, getting up the ice that way and jarring a puck loose. The extenders, I love that. That was kind of more my role as a player. So, I've got a little bit of a fondness towards it. So how do you carry? How do you play make? How do you maybe you draw guys in before you dish out? You create space for your teammates, those finishers who've got the shot, whether it be a one timer off the carry, good like deking. I find is starting to go out of the game with the younger players. I'm blaming the stick technology at this point because it's so good. Like everyone's got a great shot, but
Yeah.
a good fake shot deke, fantastic. Still works like a charm. But you
Yeah,
used to
and
see that
it,
all
it
the
looks
time.
so satisfying too. Like, like, God, when you get that off, like that was more my role. You could say arguably still is in beer league nowadays, but being more of that either end of possession extender to get to that final catalyst or being the catalyst. And so that's an area of the game I've always kind of really looked at. And funnily enough, I'm doing this next bit of work I'm doing in LB hockey, specifically looking at offensive tendencies in their players and how it can add maybe a dimension to either line compatibility or how it integrates within team systems. So I'd say look out for that because that's something I think that's really of interest.
That'll be cool. Because then there's the other piece of this is like doing what needs to be done. Like for me when I was playing, it's like, okay, do I need to be the extender or do I have one of those? Because if I have an extender on the line, um, I just call it the puck carrier. Like they're going to be the ultra reliable right spot Patrice Bergeron. Okay, that's going to allow me to go two steps ahead to where the play is going to go. Um, versus do I need to be that guy who just simply connects, keeps the flow of the play going, and that's the best part for the team. So like, what is the line? What does the team actually need, and being able to fill
Hmm.
that because there's a lot of players. I look at Lucas Reichel, for example, like could be in the NHL, has talent to be in the NHL. You go look at the World Championships, and he's always one of the better scorers. But does he buy into figuring out what does the team need me to do at this moment to have success, or just keep the puck moving in a good direction rather than I'm this and I stick to it, and not very variable, not very flexible,
Yeah,
not very
the
easy to. It's
adaptability
the
is
old,
huge.
yeah, the
Yeah,
easy to work with. Just be easy to work with.
yeah, agreed. It's a huge area of the game, and I think that could be another spot to look at is looking at how players can fit in multiple roles is something that could be interesting. Oh, maybe I'll add that to the short list of things to to try to calculate in that next piece. But
I'm
yeah,
not
as
sure
you
you're gonna be
said,
able to
like
get to that because I think about like the NFL, like that's a huge thing for them is can you play multiple positions? Like
yeah,
soccer
that's
is
a good
going
point.
that direction too of like the ability to be flexible and play in many different role situations is a valuable thing that will raise your stock. It will make you a multimillionaire versus never made it to the NFL.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm more of a specific hockey guy, so I only watch those games as much as I here and there during the off season. But watching the World Cup recently is has been great just to think about how those exact types of play styles within a different sport and those interactions with whether it's adaptability or looking at how they integrate their teammates and systems kind of apply to different sports. And obviously, I'm really excited to see how Canada does personally against Stunner. I can't believe it's going to be South Africa rather than South Korea. That was a crazy game yesterday, but being able to watch that brings a whole new appreciation to how it applies to other sports for sure.
And then I'll throw one idea out to you on this. The idea of technical or tactical empathy. So they're two separate ideas.
Mm,
So technical empathy would be like where you put a puck to make the play easier for the next player. I think of Panarin, like he constantly like puts his stick behind him on the rush, so he's left winger going up the wall, his stick's behind him. Like he wants that puck on his forehand. He's asking for it there, or if you're a playmaker, where are you passing it to your guy? Are you putting it in his feet, making his life miserable and really hard? Are you putting it towards pressure where contact is inevitable? Or are you putting it to an area where it's going to be a little bit easier for him? Maybe the defender now has to chase a little bit, and that gives the initiative to your teammate. So that's one example. There's plenty more of technical empathy there. It could be waiting with the puck, etc. Do you fire it there? Do you make it soft? Is it easy one timer, not easy one timer? And then
Hmm.
the tactical empathy would be like movement to open space is the most common one you'll think of. So like if you're watching the World Cup right now, a player say he's on the wing, so far out near the out of bounds line, and they move into the middle. They draw out that left or right back, and then a pass gets made into that spot to a fullback, right back, left back, going into that space and driving, where that space, if you just played that ball to the outside player, you got a contested one-on-one. It's very difficult to get into that space versus, oh, I've drawn that player out of that space. I think that is a curious spot. I'm not sure how many players play with that level of intelligence and with how fast and how we get there. But just I'll throw that out there, especially in soccer, because I think it's much easier to see. Hockey's so fast
Yeah,
and chaotic, it's very difficult. But soccer, I think it happens a lot slower, so you can really see it, which is why I always
right.
recommend if you want to get better vision at hockey, like go watch some soccer because the patterns are very similar.
Hmm.
They happen a lot slower, so it's much easier to pick up versus hockey, which is so bang bang. Especially if you're looking at the puck, like you're never going to pick any of this up. Like you have to have the intention to not watch the puck and just watch everything else in order to even start to see these things.
Yeah, and that, as you mentioned, that sort of like I like to call it like player gravity, right? With how you draw in things like that is an area that I think could be really interesting if we had the data to measure it, right? Right now, like how do you even go about measuring that? What's available? I don't know, but it's something that I think could come to the forefront a little bit more once or if I don't know at this point the NHL makes the raw NHL edge data available because then you have all of those specific points at every millisecond and where the puck is and you can better track the flow of the game, right? And how it develops. As you said, soccer it happens a little slower and you're able to track it a lot more with hockey. There's so much chaos. Like even looking at how the game is, you have so many more parts that are way more inconsistent, whether that's the quality of the ice as the game goes on, literally having a cylinder instead of a perfect sphere as your playing object and having to play it with a separate part of your body. And it just brings in so much chaos. But being able to measure a player's impact on the flow of the game, specifically, rather than just trying to isolate some other sort of play driving and looking at gravity. Like, I guess this is pretty timely with the draft coming up tomorrow now as we're recording this. But Gavin McKenna is a kind of player that I look at, and obviously there's a few flaws with his game, and he's just such an interesting kind of player because he falls, I think, into the Nikita Kucherov mold. I don't know if he'll get quite to that level, probably not, because just of how fantastic Kucherov is. But if I'm thinking of a player that can really use their gravity, obviously maybe not as much in the physical sense, but more in how they direct their routes on certain plays. Like there was an assist that I saw he had for Penn State earlier in the year where the specific behavior that he has on that zone entry completely changes the game just with one turn, right? Because he's not just burning down the middle and then looking up quickly to see if he either has a shot or a pass. You cut it and delay and specifically draw in the forwards or the defenseman on the other team to a bit more of a stop. And that allows your flanker to just completely dart down. And then because you've essentially used the gravity that you have with the puck to open that lane and give your teammate more space, it's way easier to just throw in a sauce through there and then boom, like high danger chance for your team. And I think it did end up resulting in a goal there. But that's an area that I think needs to be looked at way more. And it's sort of the incalculable statistics when you look at players like Kucherov that is such a high level playmaker and maybe might not obviously he has a dynamic highlight reel, but not to the level of the McKinnons or the McDavids with how much of a train they can be. It's just those levels of smarts is something I wish we could have more statistics on because that's something that's really entices me with the specific game of hockey. Yeah.
I bet something with like passes behind defensemen that are caught by teammates would be an interesting one because I think the same, like whether it be an overlapping kind of run, but just like I talk a ton about 2-on-2s with my team and like how do we break down the defense, and it's all
Hmm.
about you got to read space in front or behind, space in front or behind, and are you
Yeah.
trying to execute the space behind? Okay, well then you need to draw that defenseman up. Are you trying to drive him back to open up the space? Like you have no help. Like, okay, probably drive the defenseman back, open up that space in the slot for the late player. Oh, you've got help. Maybe we want to not burn it around the edge, but we want to slow it up and allow the other person to attack. So making sure that player off the puck is attacking into that space that the defenseman is no longer backing into. Or if that defenseman does back into it because you've successfully drawn their attention, well, now that guy's got to walk into the slot with a great
Yeah, you have
opportunity to shoot
space.
the puck. Yeah, like it's
Yeah.
around space creation, you're right with like the idea around gravity and how do you like I always think about the classic like you're walking up the wall with your defenseman, you're taking him out of being low and into maybe a more uncomfortable spot. And do you then drive just into space and find space, or do you drive at a teammate's check, the person that's playing them? So you're creating an intentional 1 versus 2. Well, now that opens up your teammate to move into
Yeah.
good spots or opens up ice where it could be maybe not directly to that teammate. It could be a cycle low, but then boom, it's right back to your teammate in the slot who now his guy, because he was trying to hold the wall and cut the top, is now completely out of position and to do third man run, good chance.
That's the
So
thing, right?
it'll,
You're saving time as well for other guys, even more support if you wanted to. And I'm specifically attached to that area because like we were talking about our styles, you and I, when we play, but I've never been a burner ever in my life. I don't have the explosiveness in my skates to do that. So that's something that's always caught my attention is how do you dictate pace of the game when you don't have the feet to kind of do it? And then it gets into the way you look at the game, the changes of speed and angles that you can do, and how you can force other players to play around, maybe not necessarily your speed, but how you change it, right? And that, again, once we get the data to measure that, I think it'll be really interesting, the kinds of visualizations and metrics we can get with that kind of data.
yeah, that'd be really cool. Yeah. The other part of my play style was definitely change of speed. I was not a burner either. But I was always doing the opposite. If the game was really fast, I was slowing it down. If the game was really slow, I'm speeding it up. Like constantly
Yeah.
trying to be, it's like the investor trying to be the contrarian at all times.
That's how you
Tends
catch
to,
people off guard and take advantage 100%.
yeah, or if you want to go fast, like do you slow down, bring them in to then have that extra jump? So you may not be the fastest, but you've always, again, taking the initiative, being the more intentional one. So, all right, we can go on and on that. But last piece I want to hit on here
Yeah.
before we end this is just kind of like development matrix. The idea
Hmm.
of instance rates, like when you're thinking about how do we best develop a player, because you can't really change a player, but you can use their assets that they have in many different ways. So how do we best use that or figure out what is that one rate limiter that we can change that'll allow them to explode into more production? Because I see so many players where I work so hard. It's like, okay, that's great activity, but what are you actually achieving? Rather than
Yeah.
understanding, okay, where are these specific spots that I need to put in the work to actually have the results go in my favor? The performance actually increases rather than I'm stronger. Okay, cool. But how are you using that strength?
Yeah, I the development matrix has a special hold on my heart because of I think how you maybe I don't know if unique is the right word, but the type of analysis you can draw from it is so different from all the other tools on the website, I think. And specifically in terms of what you said, applying it to coaching and development of your players and how you can maximize strengths or change player tendencies, as you said, improving a player is difficult, but getting them to change specific tendencies in their games to adjust to their strengths can be way easier, right? And not just because applying those changes within a player's toolkit can be easier, but specifically talking to them about it and pointing those out, it's something that you can really build a rapport with a player with much easier. Like looking at specifically, hey, you're really good at this, this, and this. However, the frequency at which you're doing them is maybe not optimal, right? You're not doing this skill enough, even though you're good at it, or you're doing this too much, and your success rate is great because those are things that are really easily isolatable for a player to think of because again, they play the game a lot, so they'll know themselves and how they are as a player, right? But going around how you can optimize those toolkits, I think is really interesting. The idea from it is from Michael Nahabedian, who shout outs to him. He just won a Walter Cup with the Montreal Victoire in the PWHL against my Ottawa Charge, which hurt me personally, but I was happy to see him uh, see him succeed. So he had built something that was pretty similar for the women's game, and I was like, the fact that we don't have this at the NHL is pretty interesting. So I figured I'd dive into it. I think it was like the second dashboard that I made because of how interested I was by the concept. it's not the most popular, but again, like the insights you can draw from it. Looking at a guy like JG Paterka, I think, for example, is really interesting because he, by pretty much all accounts, had a down year after having an almost 70-point pace season before being traded from Buffalo to Utah. And then this year, still gets 25 goals, but doesn't even reach the 50-point mark. And then you think, okay, what went wrong? And I think a lot of that was specifically he didn't integrate as well on the power play. And that's something you can look at, right? He was getting a lot of minutes and opportunities on the power play, but his success rate wasn't great. So then in the offseason or going into next season, what do you work on? Do you work on his habits and getting him to learn the power play system more? Or do you think that's not as much something you want to leverage anymore and you move that a little bit less into his toolkit, bring him down into the lineup, maybe on the second unit more, or just not on the power play at all, and then focus on other skills, right? Something that he's really, really strong at is being able to finish in close. But he wasn't really getting chances in front of the net as often as you'd like for a player of that level. So I think that works into the power play aspect, right? You bring him in a closer spot on the power play, despite him having a really good shot from long range as well. How do you utilize both his close and long range finishing, maybe into a spot on the power play, and then do those both improve each other and get it to a spot where there's skills that he's good at and are used frequently? Because again, that's how you get the most juice out of your lineup, especially in a league where there's so much parity and restrictions with whether it's just players wanting to be on specific teams or cap situations. I think it's a really interesting area of the game. And again, being able to build that bridge between the coaching staff and the players with the data, the development matrix is exactly the kind of tool that I think helps you do that and improves pretty much all parties involved.
So I've had many discussions um, around this general concept, and I think you hit on it, and it's more you see it more often with higher level of hockey, like players that have good playing performances and they're playing higher. But the idea around the self-assessment, like knowing yourself, like knowing your skill set. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if you're coaching youth, like this would be a good time to check in and figure out which players have that, which ones don't. You'll figure it out pretty quickly. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but is a massive foundational cornerstone piece of this if you're putting this on the player, which it needs to be on the player. Like they need to be able to own their own development. And just raising the ability and opportunities to have accurate self-assessment, like asking questions rather than providing answers, helping them understand that. Because there's the self-assessment piece that goes into how do we best leverage the skills that I have and where am I putting myself on the ice? What situations am I commonly putting myself into? Are they good? Are they bad? Do they lean into my skills? Do they lean out of my skills? Um, that is so I just want to bring that up as one of the foundational pieces, which if you're working in the NHL, it's probably for the most part very easy and click. And then you've got some random players like Line that may not get it. So you should definitely, sorry, I'm anti Line. Unbelievable talent. I think his application of said talent, and he may not like hockey that much either, so that may be part of it, and that's personal.
Yeah,
It's
I do
that's
think as
fine, but yeah,
well. Yeah, I do think another thing is obviously having that sort of self-identification and accountability is huge to drive development for a player. But when you look at it through the lens of both success rate and frequency, you're essentially giving a player two options, right? You're not pigeonholing them specifically to you need to improve this or you need to change how you play this way. This is kind of giving them the option of do you would you rather work on this skill to help it match how often you're using it, or would you like to repress it maybe a little bit, don't use it as often and leverage other skills instead and focus on that? And I think that's really interesting is like for players to give them sort of that option. As you said, some are going to take to improving certain areas of the game better than others. And having that innate level of accountability and self identification is huge for development. And you'll see players being able to improve their toolkits either at a more rapid rate or just to a better level, right? But again, it's an area that again doesn't have as much focus in terms of visualizations and metrics. So it's another area that I really wanted to be able to dive into and provide some sort of analysis for.
all right. Anything else that we should touch on here? We're coming up on time. I like to keep these short enough where you could listen to it on the way to the rink and back to the rink and finish it up. So appreciate you coming on. Anything we missed?
I don't think anything in particular. I mean, like we've talked about pretty much exactly the the types of analysis that I like doing the most with LB Hockey. If anybody wants to check it out, it's pretty easy. It's lb-hockey.com. You know, it's available. Some of the dashboards are available for free. We talked about being able to play through contact, all these sorts of visualizations that come with articles are available to be seen there. If you want to read more on which skills are really important, we have an article on that, how to play through contact, that kind of trying to capture a team's offensive flow. There's another piece on that. And just generally anything you can think of hockey analytics wise, even if you're like interested in more silly stuff, we have a dashboard that correlates players to Pokemon. Like that's there too. Why not? You know, blending hobbies, because why not? We can do that. And with free agency coming along too, we rolled out this contract projector last year that's available, and I think has done pretty well. If you're looking at Alex Tuck, who just signed yesterday for 8 years, 10.5 million. We had the likely term being 8 years at 10 million, so only 500K off. Pretty happy with that. So if you're interested in looking at all sorts of analysis, it's available for, I'd like to say, a pretty reasonable price, whether monthly or yearly, at lb-hockey.com. Feel free to check it there. But yeah, I think we've touched on everything I was open to talk about with you, Greg. It's been a great time, man. Again, anytime I get to talk about hockey, it's a blast, and specifically diving into those levels of analysis and hearing how it relates to youth play and development has been really interesting.
Yeah, I love meshing because they are two different worlds, but we can glean
100%.
from them, but maybe we don't want to copy them.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate it again. lb-hockey.com if you want to check them out. Lewis, always a good time.
Yeah. Thanks again, Greg.
That concludes this week's episode. Thanks for joining us here at Hockey IQ. If you haven't already, take a quick moment to hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and drop a review. If you want to be a great teammate, even recommend us to a friend. You can follow us at Hockey's Arsenal on Twitter and Instagram. Check out the website hockeysarsenal.com, where you can subscribe to the weekly newsletter. You won't regret it. Catch you buttes here next week for a brand new episode.